Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this ongoing conversation that the Childhood Art Speaker Series is creating. It is such a huge honor to be here and to be alongside so many scholars that I admire so deeply. Thank you, Dr. Schulte, Dr. Park, and Dr. Cornwall, for your labor in holding these dialogues and for everything that the Center for the Study of Childhood Art is provoking. Surely the arts feel ever more crucial, and I'm just so grateful for this space and to be here today. So I will share my screen. Everybody can see that okay? Yeah, awesome. So the title of my talk is Learning to Weave in Petrotime, and I'm going to share some small instances of learning to weave with plastics. And I'm thinking here through weaving as a way, as an act of research in its own right, and also as a way of thinking about and creating pedagogies in early childhood education. And so before I share with you the context of this pedagogical work and my doctoral research in Cuenca, Ecuador, I'd like to just briefly speak to this word, petrotime, that's been sticking with me. Environmental humanities and visual culture scholar Heather Davis offers the concept of petrotime to describe the multiple colliding temporalities of climate change. As Davis says, the burning of fossil fuels for petrochemicals like plastics involves an ancient geologic pace, a compression of lifetimes of flora and fauna under the earth, and the rapid burning of millions of years at once released into the present. And so I'm curious about the ways in which plastics seem to materialize this complex temporality of petrotime. The refining and polymerization of crude oils into plastics brings about the issue of duration and plastics' immutable longevity, their enduring ephemeral glow. For Davis, petrotime gestures not only to duration, but also to a quality of speed, as modernity crashes into a past not yet felt, she says. There's a lag between fossil fuels released many years ago and the warming of the planet. We have yet to feel the full impact of what's already happened, she says. The past has yet to arrive. The concept of petrotime also speaks to the acceleration of endings in the form of mass extinctions, warming oceans, as well as the movement of multiple human and animal migrations. At the same time, still here with Davis, for those of us with the wealth and privilege to feel a sense of distance or shelter, petrotime creates a temporal lull, a feeling of waiting, an anxious sense or suspect that something is looming. In Davis's words, in petrotime, sometimes it feels as if nothing is happening, and other moments it feels as if the whole globe is on fire or drowning. Living in petrotime brings about a contradictory affect that's difficult to register, especially in early childhood education, a field that has been deeply figured by humanism's logics of clarity, control, clock times, milestones, and measures. The temporal impasse or pause of petrotime, this sense of waiting, is often also lived alongside a macro overwhelm of disaster rhetoric that also feeds into this peculiar time loop. Anticipation for an apocalypse yet to come creates a sort of paralysis, a retreat. And here, leaning on the late Val Plumwood, this retreat inhibits some humans to imagine and work out different ways of living with the earth. And I think this resonates too with anthropologist Natasha Myers, who said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Weaving does not involve grand gestures. It's an intimate and meticulous work where subtle repetitions give shape to an emerging form, one which comes into existence through a living archive of folded folds. Weaving brings about a recurring juncture of material where the consistency of folds create tempo, speed, and with this, a temporality. The following fold consistently swallows the shape of the last, and little by little, the entire form of the weave answers to this minor variation. Weaving creates material conditions for thinking haptically through the motions of plastic's distinct temporal geontology. As Davis says, plastic is a trickster that cracks time, and through its unearthly existence and span outside of cycles of life and death, it has come to represent a material apex of the Cartesian split. In other words, plastics become a material manifestation of humanism's superiority fantasy, the delusion that we are somehow separate from nature. Resuturing this split has been the focus of an ongoing pedagogical collaboration with a school called Santana alongside the Cabo Gana mountain in a neighborhood called Ricar in the Ecuadorian Andes. At Santana's early childhood program, Nivel Inicial, a group of young children, educators, and researchers have been attempting to recuperate ancestral weaving knowledges in response to the accumulation of toxic plastics that are deeply enlaced in this place. These Andean lands are sustained by the Quechua-speaking peoples who care for the mountains and sacred highland waters in the midst of intensifying violences such as Canadian mining, and as I'll be discussing today, the explosive growth of plastic waste materials. Our work is part of the Climate Action Childhood Network directed by Dr. Veronica Piscini-Quechabao. As a part of this broader project, we've been rethinking managerial recycling practices through the arts at Santana. I was invited into this work with Santana and to Cuenca 6 years ago by Dr. Piscini Cachabao, Dr. Cristina Delgado Vintimila, and Dr. Sylvia Kind. And much of what you'll hear today has been thought alongside them and in deep collaboration with the children educators and the director of Santana, Pablo Augusto Crespo. Santana has a legacy in Cuenca as a nonprofit school, which 40 years ago decided to invent an educational project that responds to difference. Since then, Santana has worked to acknowledge children's multiple ways of being in a broader educational climate, deeply embedded in traditional Catholic educational practices, which in Cuenca often value uniformity. And so I want to really acknowledge that this work does not begin or come from me, and that these ideas emerge from relations and bodies of work that were nourished over so many years, well before my entrance. And so my role in this project has been to think alongside children and educators in initiating pedagogical moves that could help us in thinking closely with the ongoing life of plastic materials that shape this place. And learning to weave in the Andes and then later on the coast cultivates this thinking. The language of weaving shapes ways of thinking pedagogy and material openings for conceptualizing childhoods and plastics together. I'm joining you today not from Ecuador, but from my new home in Treaty 7 territory in Alberta. This place was named Mohkinstsis by the Blackfoot peoples, and it was then renamed by Scottish settlers as Calgary. And so continuing to weave with plastics here in Mohkinstsis, I look to Métis scholar Zoe Todd, who helps me to think about plastics not as these inert chemical abstractions, but rather as fossil kin, which brings about different kinds of obligations, relations, and ways of thinking time. And so, as I hold on to these threads of our work with Santana here now in Mokinstis, I've become really curious in imperfectly and partially tracing the movements of these fossil kin as they're extracted from the earth about 7 hours north of where I am here in the Canadian petrostate. Alberta's tar sands spread across several First Nations territories, communities who persistently resist and invent with capitalism's destructive path, creating new forms of life in the ruins. The oil sands pictured here can literally be seen from space, yet somehow become invisible in the Canadian cultural imaginary. 74% of the oil from Alberta is sold to the United States, where it's then refined for diesel, gasoline, and petrochemicals, particularly for plastic production in the Gulf Coast, in an area that's referred to as the Chemical Corridor or Cancer Alley. And so, as you'll hear about a little later in the talk, much of this plastic from the United States becomes embedded in Ecuadorian lands in unregulated landfills that scatter the coastline. And so, though plastics have this transcendent, ubiquitous logic, a stubborn, universalized materiality, as Davis puts it, plastics also move through very specific social and political waste flows. And so encounters with plastics across their many transformations and movements are very far from universal. They're intimately textured by race, gender, class, species, and other embodied figurations. And so this ongoing struggle in trying to trace plastics movements brings to the fore, for me, questions about how what happens distinctly in one place matters to another. And so these are questions that I'm moving closer toward. But for now, in this time that we have together, I'd like to take us to another place. The sun is rising as I walk along the edges of Cuenca's artisanal market, Mercado Rotary. This square block is usually bursting at its seams with handmade goods and local materials: clay pots, woven rugs, small sewn children's dolls, wooden spoons, and bowls. Though at this early hour, shopfronts are silent and all is hidden behind large woven plastic bags called saquillos that have been cut open and sewn together as blankets. I'm here with particular instructions from an auntie of one of the children at our school. On Wednesdays, very early in the morning, a woman stands at the northeast corner of the plaza selling pajatoquilla, a typical Andean straw used for traditional fine weaving. I meet this woman on the sidewalk where she's waiting with a collection of brightly colored saquillos that hold overflowing bundles of straw. As she speaks to me, her hands move, quickly tossing and tying strands of grasses into more bundles. She speaks Spanish like many Cuencanos, with tones that sing high and low like the flows of the river that shape this city. She sets the materials down and, with empty hands resting between bent knees in a pleated skirt, continues to tell me about her process braiding the fibers of straw. Your knots must be tight enough to hold shape and loose enough to move with the weave, she tells me. These techniques, taught to her by her grandmother, are similar to the ones she uses to weave her plastic saquillo bags. Her words move to a rhythm that corresponds with hands that have now begun a dance below, thumbs and fingers swiftly rolling over and under, weaving an invisible braid. A teacher at the school tells me it's common for the hands of Andean tejedoras, or women who weave, to move in this way with a life of their own. She says, weaving is like a memory of the body, and that's forever. Whether they notice or not, the hands keep braiding. In Ecuador, weaving is a millennial practice of many families, an economic livelihood, a language, and a worldview that takes form in heterogeneous ways across particular regions. It's often said that Ecuador as a country is made of multiple distinct yet relating worlds, each with a particular physical geography that deeply figures ecologies and ways of being. These ways of being are echoed in the languages of weaving that shape and are shaped by certain places. Coastal port cities, the Andean mountains, and the innermost Amazon jungle have particular dialects of braiding. As Denise Arnold and Elvira Espejo discuss, in the Andes, woven artifacts are not only texts that can be read to share information across the mountain, they're also considered living beings. Weavers breathe life into these beings through the opening and closing of the braid, a conspiration of warp and weft. In this way, weaving is not an activity to do with children. It's an act of life making. Weaving is about creating life and a way or a manner of living. As a medium of place and culture, weaving has immense pedagogical significance in Ecuador. Within an educational project that seeks to inherit plastics alongside young children in the Andes, the language of weaving unsettles prevailing categories of thought from the north that play out at Santana. It situates our pedagogical work within long-standing folds of Andean memory and ongoing contemporary improvisations. Held in tension, because of tension, and continually worked with in the braid. Weave is a generous word. In English, it's both noun and verb, a thing and a doing. Weaving in Cuenca, my friends tell me that in Quechua, weaving is called aguachina, yet aguachina cannot be reduced into Spanish or English translations because its meaning is lived and shaped through a life, a doing, an interlacing of fibers in a specific place with particular histories and land relations. I think about the relations I'm tangled up with in the weave, braided with moving settler knots to Ecuador and Turtle Island. I think through this imperfectly with the help of Peruvian scholar Marisol de la Cadena when she says, "My world is included in the world that my friends inhabit and vice versa, but their world cannot be reduced to mine or mine to theirs." Yet this difference is not mutual exclusion. As Juana, my teacher on the coast, tells me of weaving on the coast, she says weaving is about being together. And rather than maintaining a separation that distinction causes, our pedagogical work tries to think with the divergences of togetherness that weaving with friends, educators, children, and with plastics intensifies. This togetherness has an indiscernible temporality, which interrupts developmental notions of linear, progressual time. It's tangled with a throbbing neoliberal pulse where weaving, as Juana explains, enables her the force to continue, to go forward, adelante, she says. Juana and her community of weavers sell their pieces to several international companies, and every month they rapidly weave over 800 purses to be sold. The intensity of this force and its accumulative growth happens alongside Juana's intimacy with place and land. Sensibilities that continue to teach her and her children that paja toquilla cannot be harvested when the moon wanes. Luna menguante, an old moon that reverses itself, carves a glowing sea in the sky and tells her that paja will die if it's touched. Weaving folds forward and back. It waxes and wanes and requires sensitivities to what Bolivian decolonial scholar Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui describes as temporalities that both antagonize and complement each other, she says, as they coexist and create new ways of being in their own right. In the making of a weave, both process and product are deeply responsive to the other. Each fold is figured in dialogue with a tension between fibers that came before. Weaving is about repetitions and a responsivity to antecedent patterns. It has this felt nature of ongoingness. Yet weaving is not only about inheritances. To weave is also to improvise. It's about attending to minor variations, perhaps even interruptions, in ways that sustain the unending rhythms of interlacing threads. A weave is predicated on the presence of conviviality, a gathering of things that is hospitable to difference and folds particular fibers together in ways that enable an enduring, contradictory presence, tight enough to hold shape, loose enough to move. In our pedagogical work, weaving gives metaphoric potential for thinking plastics and childhoods together in the Andes. However, weaving is more than metaphor. It's always exceeded by on-the-ground material enactments. And though this initial work together with Santana generated significant shifts quite quickly in the school, the ephemeral presence of child development and its neoliberal logics continues to haunt pedagogical desires and impulses. And this oscillating presence creates a moving refrain with which we consistently respond to as we attempt to create curriculum that weaves us together in a life with plastics in Ricard, a very particular place with particular relations to plastics. Directly beside Santana on the other side of a chain link fence is a dense eucalyptus forest rooted in ancestral clay. Plastics are deeply entangled here, woven between spiraling tree roots. While intense photodegradation of plastics in Andean mountains, such as the Cabogana, contribute to increasingly toxic waters and pose significant threats to several species on the brink of extinction, plastics also hold an integral role in sustaining the ecological structures of life in this place. For example, with the clear cutting of Andean forests for cattle pastures, many riverbanks are now visibly upheld by woven plastic saquillos that become part of the soil where plants root. These bags, now made in local factories, have replaced the ones traditionally woven by local people using vegetable fiber such as pajatoquilla, cabuya, or carrizo. Plastics are cheaper and they don't cause cuts or splinters. In the forest beside Santana, saquillos nestle between small stones in networks that frame the banks of a creek that move through the mountain and across the schoolyard, simultaneously poisoning life and sustaining the rivers of this valley. Saquillos participate in ongoing ancestral knowledges that move with emerging and disconcerting convivialities of this place. In Cuenca, plastics are already knitted into what Vanessa Andreotti might call the living metabolisms of land and culture. Plastics are an integral part of this place, yet in a pedagogical context that centered the individual developing child, plastics could not be inherited as active shapers of place and culture or of curriculum. Within these conditions, the life of Ricard and its materials were overlooked, especially toxic ones like plastics that threaten long-held desires for the purity and freedom of childhood in a harmonious nature. We first began this project with Nivel Inicial in educational conditions that were quite divorced from place. Plastics entered the classroom impoverished of their relations, often through one-time crafts and classroom decorations. Plastic bottles turned to cartoon characters from the North and other symbolisms that spoke to developmentalism's universal child, which shaped much of Nouvelle Initiale's culture of education, aesthetic, and way of thinking about curriculum. The logics of recycling in early childhood also work in relation with developmental psychology's um, individual autonomous child, a child who grows in a linear, measurable trajectory, one who learns about the world through mastery and control. Within this view, plastics are instrumentalized towards some kind of skill or free creative outlet for the child. And thinking here with Dr. Marissa McClure-Sweeney, within this developmental lens, the myth of children's inherent creativity and their innovative solutions become a promise for continual economic progress, which separates children from vulnerability to toxic dependencies within increasingly synthetic worlds. So these developmental discourses, of course, are very common in our field and tend to render plastics and their socio-political dimensions invisible via recycling or solutions to simply clean up the outdoors. These practices overlook neocolonial waste flows that figure children's encounters with plastics. And it matters here that Ecuador has been positioned in exploitive international trade relations. This exploitation was intensified after the pandemic when Ecuador was in growing vulnerability and debt to the United States and agreed to take on the US's non-recyclable plastics. 96% of these plastics are buried directly into the land. I think it's also important to mention here, as I'm speaking from the Canadian context, that over 90% of plastics here in Canada don't get recycled, which is quite comparable to data coming from the United States, which is around 95% of plastics don't get recycled there. As waste scholar Myra Hurd says, recycling practices put waste out of sight and out of mind. Recycling perpetuates neoliberal consumerism by creating an appeasing notion of individual morality and good citizenship, making it very difficult to engage with our present petrol moment, as well as our differential accountabilities to places and people unevenly marked by the effects. Sylvia Rivera Cusicanqui, though not speaking of recycling, discusses these kinds of social shifts as a change so that everything remains the same. Early childhood scholars Kelly McAlpine and Veronica Piscini-Cachabao have also highlighted in their pedagogical work how recycling leaves the accumulative logics that now fuel human life intact. And so much of our initial collaborations with Santana involved rethinking this persistent reference to child development and recycling from the North and trying to slow down and pay attention to the Cabo Gana. We wanted to listen for minor instances that might help us enter into a different kind of dialogue with plastics. And as Sylvia Kind tells us, to defamiliarize ourselves from what we think we already know about this material, to attune to how plastics shape us as much as we shape them. And we noticed an opening to re-encounter plastics in a small moment with the children during one of our walks in the plastic debris-filled forest. Walking in the forest, a child notices a fallen nest. Delicately woven by the beaks of the glossus birds, this prickly home is composed of knotted fibers, fine sticks, dried grasses, and muted blue plastic candy wrappers. Each piece is distinct, indispensable, and carefully structured. The children ask why the bird left his house here. They decide to leave it on the ground in case he returns for it. The next day in the forest, we find the nest, again still empty and on the ground. The children suggest we should bring the nest back to the classroom as it might need repairs for the bird to return to his home. And so we noticed this as a pedagogical opening to perhaps think differently with plastics. Documentation of the nest's generated questions about what it might mean to find refuge in a shelter, both comforting and toxic. And ethical questions also arose as the nest's structural dependency on plastics created a hesitancy about habitual practices of extracting and moving litter from the forest. Noticing its delicate architectures, one of the teachers, Chris, was reminded of her family's weaving traditions, and over several weeks, she shared these memories with the children. The nest became a figure that helped us to think about how we might create pedagogical conditions kin to nesting in the classroom. Nesting has a particular nature and involves processes of gathering heterogeneous filaments to make a home. Nests are hospitable to difference and require sensibilities to how particular fibers might be held together toward the structural purpose of sustaining a life. Attempting to maintain the nest's existing contradictory relations inside the school, the classroom was curated into a nesting room with bundles of grasses, rolls of plastic yarn, sakio bags, needles, and other materials prepared over a large woven rug for close experimentations. Over several months, we wove together using Chris's family's weaving methods and the children's improvisational strategies. A massive nest began to take shape. And as if the nest was holding them as they worked, inside educators and children continued weaving together, braiding various homes and structures for animals of the plastic forest, using kabuya grasses and long plastic threads unraveled from sakio bags. Weaving together opened up sensitivities to different ways of being with and noticing plastic materials over long durations of time. The Andean language of weaving asks for a bodied knowledge where fingers feel the meeting places and equilibrium of folds with a sensitivity that for more advanced weavers like Chris seems unthought. For novice weavers such as myself and the children, weaving requires a careful attention, and though it gives rise to a tempo, its pulse is often interrupted by strain, pauses, unravelings. The weave often begins and begins again. This consistent returning to, folding and folding again with variation, asks something of how a weaver thinks and acts, while becoming sensitive to the fold's dependency on what came before, and how it might act as a threshold for emergence. In this sense, weaving is figured by a past that is actively discerned and reshaped by the weaver. These are minor sensitivities that we began working with the children. Andean weaving also activates sensitivities to plastics. Weaving intensifies these particularities, especially when plastics are woven alongside grasses. When woven on its own, plastic yarn proposes a weave that is quick-paced, where folds have a tendency to slide together with little room between. Plastic yarn braids a moving pace of the hands that is fast and slick. Braided alongside grasses and straw, plastic yarn complicates the meeting place of the fold with a smooth slipperiness and lightness. And when they're worked with together, each fold becomes shaped by diverging material temporalities, confronting the weaver with a struggle in holding disparate fibers together in a sustained and endurable rhythm. The language of weaving creates a particular way of being with plastics in early childhood education, one which interrupts the prevailing figure of the human as a manager of plastic worlds. It's a practice that requires, as Stephanie Bunn suggests, a working with rather than a doing to. Working with plastics in the weave complicates the idea that plastics are static, passive, or a material children can simply act upon or solve. Through its processes, weaving proposes a reformation of the constitutive categories that often overdetermine child-plastic relations. And at the same time, weaving knits the children into ancestral land knowledges that have sustained their community for millennia. Over time, this inquiry began contaminating other classrooms and groups of children. Weaving became a language of inquiry into the life of the plastic creatures that the children speculate might live in the plastic forest. The nests came into conversation with synthetic woven bodies and their cocoons. And we were really inspired at this time by the artist Pinar Yoldash and her exhibit Ecosystems of Excess, where she envisions what might happen if life emerged from the ocean's plasticky soup. And so her exhibit involves these beautifully disturbing organs of the plastisphere, lungs, liver, various sensory organs of creatures that have learned to become and live with plastics, which is actually not far off from what some ocean creatures are doing right now in birthing these strange bacterial communities with plastics. In the atelier, we inhabited a question for over a year. What kind of life might emerge from a plastic debris-filled forest? The teachers renamed the atelier the Plastic Vivarium. The children's projects in the vivarium really enlivened this haptic experience of being enwrapped, grown, and born from a plastic cocoon, an immersion into the intimacies of various synthetic bodies becoming alive and their emerging modes of communication. And we really tried in the atelier to slow down with the children in their questions to try and figure out what it would be like to be born from a plastic cocoon. What does it feel like to speak and learn to speak from plastic vocal cords? Um, a short film of the children's projects is on our website, and the film works with pedagogical documentation from the inquiry, and it's figured by its correspondences to a recurring audio composition by the children and their speculative sounds of the sonic life of the plastic forest. It's a kind of a creepy score that's sung from the vibrations of plastic lungs and vocal cords, which is a whole other thread that I won't pull on today, but maybe another time. So returning now to Chris's class and the weaving with the nests, we wanted to slow down to the uneasy processes of nesting with plastics alongside the children. And so we made decisions to take up small, ordinary acts of attention. So for example, at the end of each day of weaving, we labored together in respooling excess wool and plastic yarn and rebundling leftover grasses and threads pulled from the sakios. In these instances, we encountered plastics not for their instrumentality in children's developmental progress, but as dynamic shapers of a shared space. In these minor acts of attention, we started to notice subtle differences in the ways of being that plastics and grasses generate. So for instance, we noticed how plastic yarn is forgiving. It can be immediately restretched and respooled as if it were new again. Kabuya and Carrizo grasses have their own singularities. They hold marks like a script of unknotted knots. The grasses must be soaked for some time to loosen before they can be used again. And so they decelerated the processes of inquiry and they demanded a different relation of us. The qualities of these materials shaped our responses to them, each proposing distinct processes and ways of being together. Leaning into these mundane acts of attention and attuning to materials resonates perhaps with Tim Ingold's idea that to know materials, we have to follow them. Their every technical gesture is a question to which the material responds according to its bent. Several of the plastic nests were eventually returned to the forest, carefully arranged in the trees by the children as a proposition for the bird who had lost his home. For us, the processes and artifacts of the children's weaving are pedagogically significant because they instigate an embodied attention to the distributed agency between children and the Kabogana's multi-species orchestra as they mutually create conditions for living together. Our work with Santana is about learning how to inhabit a place in its impurity, where learning is about a capacity for relation making and coming to think through the conditions of our times. This project attempts to embed itself in the folds of Rakar, however partially, as it is marked in particular ways by neocolonial violences and lively Andean land relations. Making curriculum with Santana as an effect of this condition emerges with a rhythm similar to the sensation of weaving with plastics, a pace that has a repetitious yet unstable pulse. In the ongoing emergence of our projects, together with the teachers, we consistently return to the sometimes ambiguous territories of the refrains with which our work responds to. A prevailing one is the presence of child development, its dynamic and conflicting definitions. As Delgado Vintimilla and Pacini Ketchabau propose, nurturing lively pedagogical spaces that loosen dominant developmental practices happens in the midst of struggles, interruptions, even failures. Weaving enlivens this notion through the generative restraints of the braid, where the tensions of fibers and irritations of their meeting places are worked with. These restraints are continually mitigated by the weaver who works with their restrictions and affordances in the fold. Refrain becomes a central force, even a function of the weave and its consequences for emergence, where the outside of one thread provokes the inside of another. Weaving helps me to think with the notion of refrain pedagogically, to think about what is the life of developmental psychology at Santana and how is this life preserved and dynamically refolded through particular educational attachments. Weaving, I anticipate an emergence as my hands work at the edge of the braid, shuffling backwards to readjust already folded folds in response to the openings they might propose. These folds are forgoing and always on the cusp of a materialization of potential. Doctors Delgado Vintimilla and Pacini Ketchabau propose that at its heart, pedagogy is about working at a life, becoming studious of it, becoming interested in its different forms and formations in what it does and how we become of it. Like the temporalities of weaving, our pedagogical work with Santana negotiates with a past and a future in the hands of the present. Complicating developmental notions of linearity, weaving has a tentative, multitemporal essence, as the weave is always becoming and responding through its connections with a history that may be at once held and remade by a present, tight enough to hold shape, loose enough to move. Thank you.